Hi, I'm Chuck at the Review Board, and this is a short introduction to the decision phase of the environmental assessment for territorial and federal governments. The main focus of the decision phase is the report of environmental assessment. This document is prepared by the Review Board to share its findings, and it includes the reasons for the Review Board's decision. In the report, the Review Board decides if the project is likely to cause impacts that matter and what should be done about them. The impacts that really matter are called significant impacts. Changes to reduce or avoid them are called mitigation measures. In this report, the Review Board recommends whether or not the project should go ahead. Some projects have been rejected, but it's unusual. If the Review Board recommends the project go ahead, it will describe any changes or mitigation measures that might be needed to avoid or reduce the impacts enough to make them acceptable. This is what happens most of the time. If the Review Board finds that the project will cause impacts that matter that can't be avoided, even with mitigation, the project could be sent for more assessment. This is called a review panel, and this happens very rarely. What happens in the decision phase? The Review Board gives its report of environmental assessment to the government decision makers. There are 3 government decision makers who make the final decision on the project, depending on where it is located. If the project is on territorial land, then the GNWT is the decision maker. If the project is on Tlicho government lands, then the Tlicho government is the decision maker. And finally, if the project is on federal lands, then the federal government is the decision maker. Some projects, like roads or power lines, can cross lands with multiple owners. These projects would have more than one decision maker. What are the roles of the decision makers? Government decision makers play multiple roles during the decision phase of a project. Decision makers must consult with Indigenous governments about the adequacy of consultation throughout the EA process steps. As a representative of the Crown, this is the decision maker's responsibility under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. In some cases, government decision makers may seek to modify mitigation measures recommended in the report of EA, or ask the board to reconsider its recommendation before a decision is made. Consultation with the Review Board is required before this can happen. Finally, the role of the ministers is to decide whether to accept the Review Board's recommendation. What will governments do in the decision phase? All governments, including the Tlicho government, if the project is on their land, will consider the Review Board's recommendation and associated mitigation measures. Decision makers should participate in the Review Board's meeting about the report of EA so they understand the contents and can seek clarity if necessary. Territorial and federal governments will conduct Crown consultation with Indigenous governments and accommodate the responses into their final decision. Decision makers also discuss the report of EA internally with responsible authorities within territorial and federal governments before reaching a decision. What questions do governments ask during Crown consultation? In the Northwest Territories, the Crown is represented by both the GNWT and CERDAC. During the decision phase, they must consult with Indigenous governments and communities on the report of environmental assessment recommendation. This is formal consultation and is required under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. During this consultation, the Crown asks if the project could impact Aboriginal or treaty rights, and if so, how could it impact those rights? If additional accommodation is needed beyond the recommendation and measures in the report of EA to address these impacts. If Crown consultation during the EA was adequate. Once Indigenous governments and communities answer these questions, the Crown responds to the Indigenous governments with its decision. What happens during the decision phase? Federal and territorial government decision makers have 5 months to consult with Indigenous governments to make a decision on the environmental assessment. Decision makers have three options. Firstly, they can accept the Review Board's reported environmental assessment recommendation along with any mitigation measures it contains to reduce or avoid the impacts. This is what happens most often. The second option is for the decision makers to accept the Review Board's recommendation, but request that the Review Board change some parts of the mitigation measures. This happens rarely and only happens after they consult with Indigenous governments. The third option is for the decision makers to tell the Review Board to reconsider its entire recommendation. This is very rare, however. To sum up, the decision phase is the final phase in an environmental assessment. Territorial and federal governments are tasked with making a decision that protects the environment, people, and Aboriginal treaty rights. Thanks.